Well, afternoon everybody. I'm Adrian Christian. I'm leading the team that's helping PESRAC, or the council. I'll use those terms interchangeably through the next little while with you through its work. So first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to be part of our process. This is an important part of the process to the council, and so I appreciate you giving up your time today and to actually undertake the stretch thinking workshops. Just by way of introduction, so I'm Adrian, the leading the PESRAC team, and with me at the table today we've got people that are assisting us with the workshop. So we've got Alicia to my right, Alicia Lees. She will be the taskmaster, keeping us all on track during the workshop. She'll be our room facilitator. And I've got Ben and Steve from the University of Tasmania. These two guys have actually developed the process that we will be using on the day. So they're the experts in the process, and they'll take you through a little bit of the detail today. But during the workshops themselves, these are the people that will be running it. So today is about setting the context for the workshop. Because we've only got 3 hours together for the workshops, we wanted to take out all of the context and briefing material and just do that when we're not collectively together around the table, because we want to preserve that time for the creative thinking, stretch thinking process where we hope to get the dividends. So today is about providing the background so that when you turn up later in the week to the workshops, we don't have to go through it, and we can use our time to do the actual process itself. So quickly, what we're going to cover today is I'll just give you a very quick introduction to PESRAC and what this part of its work program is all about, the council. Then we'll talk about the workshops and what they're about. We'll very briefly take you through the 2 scenarios that we're going to use. We'll introduce the methodology. The uni guys will be telling you about that. And Alicia will cover off how we're going to conduct the day and the rules of engagement. So that's what we are going to cover today. Before we talk about the workshops, just very briefly about PESRAC, the council. So it was appointed by, it's 9 members, appointed by the Premier, appointed back in March to provide advice to the government, the business sector and the community about recovery from COVID. The council had 3 tasks to deliver. One was an immediate report on immediate things that it thought needed to be done. It had a second report to give some ideas to the government to inform the budget that will be handed down in November. And then it was given a third job of looking at longer term recovery. So we've done the first 2 of those. They were in an interim report that we completed in July. It's available on our website if you were interested to read it. It's 64 recommendations, and it was really about the here and now. So the council has done that work, it's finished. We're not revisiting it. We made 64 recommendations to the government. The government has said, they weren't all for the government, but almost all of them were for the government. The government says they've accepted all of those recommendations and are working through the implementation of them at the moment. So with that part of the job done, we're now into phase 2 of our work, the final phase, in the lead up to a final report in the first quarter of next year. And that's all about longer term recovery measures that the government should consider, that the business should consider, and the community should consider. So that's what PESRAC is, the council. It's all about COVID recovery. So the purpose of phase 2, this phase of work that we're in now with the council, it's all about practical recommendations for recovery strategies that will deliver outcomes, not right here and now in the short term, and not over 10, 15, 20, 30 years, but will deliver outcomes in the next 2 to 5 years. So the council's looking over the horizon, over the time horizon, not looking at the here and now, looking to the medium and longer term, and wants to develop recommendations that will deliver outcomes in a 2 to 5 year time frame. The council's not in the space of the big vision, creating a whole new vision for Tasmania, and it's not about quick wins. It's about practical measures, 2 to 5 year outcomes. Importantly, the council's view is that their recommendations they are looking to make in this final report to assist Tasmanians and Tasmanian organisations build their own future. It's not so much the council or PESRAC going out and picking winners. It's more looking at constraints and enablers for Tasmanians to build their own future as we come out of COVID. And the third point is they're not just reporting to the government, they're reporting to the whole of the Tasmanian community, because all Tasmanians have got a part to play in recovery from COVID. It's far too big a job just for government. So that's what Phase 2 is all about. And in working through those, developing those recommendations, we've got a number of outreach activities. We've got the workshops, which we'll spend our time on today, but in addition to the workshops, we've got a call for submissions for Tasmanians to bring any recovery ideas to the council. Builds on what we did in Phase 1. We've got a wellbeing survey where we are inviting all Tasmanians to take part. That will be going live a little later in the month and will be open for about a month, when we're asking Tasmanians about aspects of wellbeing, how well they are travelling currently relative to how they were pre-COVID, and most importantly what their relative priorities are for recovery, looking at different aspects of their individual wellbeing. So they're outside of this process that we're working with you on. So that's the cross-sector what if COVID workshops, which is that's what we're talking about today. And then after we've done those workshops, we'll be having some regional playbacks with a different group of people playing back what we've heard out of these workshops to help refine the council's thinking about its recommendations. So they're the 4 parts of the outreach work of the council. But what we're talking with you about is the what if workshops. So their purpose, what we're looking to do in these workshops, is to use scenarios as a way of thinking about the future, to anchor us into the future, to think about future opportunities, future constraints, and the consequences of COVID in the medium term. And by getting you around the table, going through a creative thinking process to bring forward information in those 3 buckets of information: the consequences, the constraints, and the opportunities. This is pretty unusual in the government processes. I've been around government close to 30 years and not been involved in the process that looks like this. Normally you would see a consultation process with issues papers and people making submissions. This is quite a different process the council's been keen to do, to develop new ideas, because COVID poses some very new problems. Importantly, these workshops are going to result in an aggregated outcome from the council. So we're not quoting anybody that's participating in these workshops. We're not quoting them as individuals or from the sectors that they work within or the businesses they work within those sectors. This is to produce a lot of rich information that we are going to distill down to some whole of government, whole of Tasmania propositions, recommendations. So that's what we're going to use the information for. What we hope that you will get out of it is the opportunity to actually participate in a process that will shape our recovery recommendations. And most importantly, we hope that coming out of this process there will be a tool, the stretch thinking process that we'll talk to you about and use in the workshop, plus the information that comes out of the workshop that can be used by businesses, organisations, peak groups to actually undertake their own future planning for COVID. So it's not just for us. We hope that there'll be a dividend coming out of the process that can be taken away and used by others for a similar purpose. So the methodology, which we'll talk to in detail at the moment, it's been developed by the University of Tasmania, and it's a tool that enables creative thinking, strategic creative thinking to take place. It's used in the real world, it's been used by governments, it's been used by commercial organisations, and Ben and Steve will talk about that. There are three components to these workshops. First thing is the scenarios. So these are stories about the future to give us something to work from and anchor our thinking. And in this case, these stories are about COVID, but in the way the technique's been applied elsewhere, they could be scenarios about anything, but these are scenarios about COVID. They're not our predictions, they're not the council's expectations about what will happen with COVID, they're just a story that we're going to use to do our stretch thinking around. The second part of it is, what are we thinking about? The stories, the scenarios provide a context. So there are 5 things that we are using these workshops to think about, and we'll in the workshops 1 and 2, which you guys are participating in, we're only looking at 2 of the 5. And I'll talk to those in a minute. And then the third component is the actual process, the actual stretch thinking process, the thinking loops that we go through, and we'll talk about them in a minute. It's worthwhile just stressing what the workshops are not about. So they're not really about the scenarios themselves. We don't want to workshop or debate the scenarios. They've got to be used as a tool. We take them as a given. We could easily spend 3 hours trying to nut out amongst ourselves a common view about what those scenarios are. Trust me, we've worked them up. We know how many hours they've taken. So we just take those as a given. When you arrive and we do the workshop, we don't want to debate or discuss the scenarios themselves. If we could just use them as a thinking tool, that's how we need to do it. And the second thing that the workshops are not about is suppression measures or other issues that you as businesses or sectors might be engaged with the government about. What we're trying to do is create a bit of space for 3 hours to think about the future and think about future opportunities, future constraints, and future consequences, not what you're dealing with in the here and now. So that's what the workshops are about and what they're not about. So I'll just quickly, we'll run through those 3 elements of it, of the scenario workshops. The first one is the scenarios themselves. So there really are two worlds that we're contemplating. In both cases, what we're asking you to do is to pretend we're in 2023. And what we're doing is telling a story about what happens between now and 2023 to think about, okay, where to from here? So there's one scenario is probably not a bad, it's a COVID not too bad scenario. And then there's one that is COVID not quite as good scenario. So this first scenario is not that dissimilar to the assumptions that the Commonwealth Government made in the federal budget last week, which I took some comfort in. That other people have got the same ideas that this scenario has got. So effectively, under this scenario, we're in 2023, we've got a long-lasting and effective vaccine developed and distributed in 2021. So we're in 2023, we're thinking back 2 years, there was a vaccine distributed. It was widely taken up in Australia and taken up globally. The national and international travel restrictions that we've come to understand as the current normal are removed in 2021. So we're in 2023. Those arrangements were removed a couple of years ago. The Tasmanian economy has gone through effectively a V shape, and right now in 2023 it's performing relatively well compared to other Australian and global economies. And looking at Tasmanians, they've generally recovered pretty well from the pandemic and have taken some of the good things that happened through the pandemic, like the technological changes, and embedded them into a new way of life. And Tasmania's got a good sense of hope about it. So that's one world, that's one story that we're going to workshop. So turning to the second scenario, it's not quite as good as the first one. Scenario B, again, still in 2023, there is a vaccine available, but vaccination rates in the country and internationally are low because there's ongoing debate around how effective the vaccine is. In between now and 2023, we've seen frequent outbreaks, ongoing restrictions on international travel to Australia, with our borders remaining closed. In terms of the economic side of things in Tasmania and globally, it's really drifted over a couple of years, and the Tasmanian economy is trending below national conditions. And in the case of Tasmanians themselves, there's increased household stress and financial hardship arising from the impacts of the virus. So they are the two scenarios. We'll send you more detail. They're written out in a fair bit, with a fair bit more detail in, probably around about 800 words each. That's what we want you to read and think about in preparing to come to the workshops. So the second building block for what we're doing is in addition to the actual scenarios, is the themes that we're using our workshops to look at. And PESRAC has identified 5 things that they want to use these scenarios activities with the nine clusters that we're putting together to look at. There are 2 economic related ones. So the first one is broadly economic activity, jobs, investment, business confidence. So that's one theme. The second one is skills, job readiness and later years education. So how well people are prepared for work. And then there are 3 more socially oriented aspects to the workshops. Consequences for access to the basics, so things like food and housing. Physical and mental health is the 4th one, and the last one is the sense of sort of community connectedness that might be relevant in 2023. So we've got a total of 9 workshops. We're not going, because we've only got 3 hours, we can't cover all of those 5 themes in every one of the workshops. So each workshop will focus on a subset of those 5. In the case of workshops 1 and 2, so for the guys that are online today, we're looking at number 1, number 2, and in the case of workshop number 1, the agriculture and food and beverage, we're looking at access to the basics, number 3, and for workshop number 2, infrastructure and logistics, we're looking at the connectedness of the community. So in both cases, workshop 1 and 2 are going to do 1 and 2, and then either 3 or 5. And as we roll through the 9 workshops, we'll get good coverage of all of those 5 issues. So, so to be clear, the scenarios are the stories that set the thinking, and we're thinking about these themes. And with that, we'll now talk about the 3rd component, which is actually the stretch methodology tool itself. So it's over to Ben and Steve.
Thanks, Ace. Hi, everyone. And I guess to respond to a significant event like this requires us to think about what the significant opportunities might be. And in order to do that, we need some level of creativity brought to that particular task. And just to reiterate, we need people who have a motivation then an intrinsic motivation to actually do that creative performance. And as Ace has already referred to, we have the Council's terms of reference, and we're looking to support Tasmania and recognise what the opportunities might be over those 2 to 5 years. And so there's got to be a motivation around that, and I think everyone who's been invited will be able to bring that motivation. The other thing that you'll be able to do is to bring skills and knowledge in the task domain for that particular cluster that are relevant and necessary in order to understand what the difference is between a good opportunity and one that might not be as good. And so that the skills and knowledge that you bring as an individual to that is going to be really important. The final part of that creative performance then is the creative process, and this is the process that Steve and I have developed over the last 3 years or so in order to be able to link creativity with scenario planning processes. Because what we're actually attempting to do is some level of divergent thinking. And one of the things that we know is that as people get older, their levels of creativity tend to drop. At the age of 5, 98% of 5-year-olds are genius level creativity, and 5 years later that's down to 30%. And I know that I'm much older than 10 years old, so will most of the people in the workshop be, and what that means is that we've got to find some way to harness the creativity that you do have. And so what we'll be doing in these workshops then is looking to use your imagination and imagine particular scenarios. Ace has already spoken to those, but we're also looking then to harness that creativity by asking unusual questions and looking at unusual uses for different resources for different things. And I'll hand over to Steve, who will be able to speak in a little bit more detail about that. Before I do that, one thing I will say is what we're looking to do is to build a nice safe space for you to speak up into during these workshops. And that's going to be really important because we want your ideas, and in fact Tasmania needs your ideas in order to recover effectively from this incident. Steve.
Thanks, Ben. So yeah, I'm Steve from the University of Tasmania, and I think just to pick up on Ben's point about psych safety, a lot of the work we do are sometimes in teams where people don't know each other. So we're going to go through a quick checklist on the day where we try and create an environment where you feel that it's safe for interpersonal risk taking. So if you've got a wacky idea or something what you think is wild, you can actually stand up and say what that is, because that what you think may be quite way out there is actually something really good that we can work with. So we're going to talk a little bit of that on the day, but that's called psychological safety. It's really important in these temporary teams when we put those together. So with regards to the stretch thinking loops, if any of you can see the slides in front of you, you may see that it's actually a loop on the page. And basically, as Ace said earlier, we'll be looking at teasing out some of the consequences, constraints and opportunities for a couple of different scenarios. But probably the easiest way to provide the context is just to run through a really obvious one that I'm pretty sure the majority of people here in the room, and especially here virtually with us today, will maybe have experienced. If, for example, we look at a certain industry and look at consequences, so if we look at maybe the restaurant industry, for example, and if we say with the current COVID-19 in a worst case or a bad, not a very good scenario where we're still in lockdown, some of the problems that I experienced and my wife also experienced as well, as she repeatedly tells me, that we couldn't go out to a restaurant. Okay, so I'm pretty sure most of you had that experience a few months ago, and especially those, if anyone's in Victoria or been in Victoria recently, they will certainly experience that. So some of the consequences in the hospitality or the restaurant industry would be around that, they can't open, potentially, especially what's happening in Victoria, they're just not opening. Okay, and the reason and the consequence of that is obviously, people can't operate a business, people may lose their jobs, etc., etc. And there's knock-on effects with that as well. It's cascading. So when we look at some of the constraints with that, in that example, obviously the obvious constraint is the rules about physical distancing. So because of the physical distance, what's applied under the Public Health Act to say we can't do that, means we have to work within those boundaries and constraints, okay? But an example of an opportunity, what we saw all across Australia, what people were doing in the restaurant trade, was flipping constraints on their head and then looking at those and turning them into opportunities. And the classic example in the restaurant industry is how people who were traditionally, fine dining restaurants, some people, actually went to takeaway. Okay, so what they did was, I know in Tasmania, some colleagues own restaurants here, and some of their waiting staff who were casual and couldn't get different government benefits, they actually went on to delivery roles. So, it created a whole new business for Uber Eats as a classic example. There's another example I saw in Sydney, which was some fine dining restaurant, and they were delivering food and recipe ideas on a YouTube channel, so they could make it at home. So your problem is that people can't come to the restaurant, so then you take the restaurant experience to someone's house, or you deliver it to someone's house. So it's about looking at the consequence, looking at the constraints, which we can't do much with, but then changing that to look at new opportunities. So what we'll just have a quick talk about next is how we're going to stretch our thinking when you come to the workshop. And how we're going to do that, we're going to use a technique which is called Scamper. Now, some of you might be familiar with this. This is a technique that was developed initially for children to assess creativity in children, but it's being used for adults as well. And there's numerous elements in the Scamper technique to really get your creative juices buzzing. All right, so the idea is we look at various words, and some of the considerations and some questioning around that is about what we can substitute, what we can combine, what we can adapt, magnify, put to other uses, what you can eliminate or what you can rearrange. And the latter one is one that what Ben and I have been using for about 3 years now with multiple industries across the private, public and not-for-profit sectors, is the rearranging. It's really about flipping things on its head. So like with the restaurant example I gave you, people can't come to the restaurant, so if you flip that on its head, what does it mean? We take the restaurant experience to them in their own home. So when we look at that, what we will be doing at the workshops is, and the facilitation team will be giving you some of these Scamper questions to get you to think about the challenges and the consequences and unpack these into opportunities. So an example could be, for example, about combination. So think about combining 2 or more parts of a process to make something new. Okay, so questions around this we've used typically what mix, assortment or ensemble might we blend together? What ideas, purpose units or appeals might we combine so it works? Okay, and the classic example I will give is the Thai cave rescue. They combine scuba diving, sedating children, okay, to have a really good opportunity to save the lives of 20 odd kids. Okay, so we're going to use this technique throughout the sessions with you guys. And just with regards to the process, we've talked about Ben and I and Ace, we have got a paper, which is like a journal article. If anyone's interested, I know Ace and his team can distribute that to you so you can have a read. It's not, I promise, it's not a boring academic paper, I hope. We've wrote it for practitioners. And so basically people who work in organisations, so it's a step-by-step guide how to use this process. So if you're interested, please email Ace and the Secretariat team and they'll be able to forward you that. And it just gives a step-by-step guide and some examples we used in a government project. Thanks.
Okay, so over to you, Alicia.
Thanks everybody. So I'll be your facilitator on the day in the workshop. And I just wanted to give you a bit of an outline of what we'll actually be doing so that you can prepare yourself. As we've mentioned this morning already, it is different to a lot of workshops that you may have attended in the past. So it's going to be really important for us to get the most out of the session, that we really stick to the workshop design, including the scenarios and the stretch thinking that Ben and Steve have been taking us through. So my job as the facilitator will be making sure that we're all able to participate at our best on the day. So in terms of the session, you'll be coming into a room and we'll obviously do some introductions and give you an overview at much less detail than obviously we have today. So very important that you do absorb what we're telling you today and that you have done your preparation, because straight away we'll be moving into the 2 scenarios as Ace has outlined. So the first scenario we'll be going through, we'll give you a little bit of time to think about what you'd like to contribute, and you'll be working on a table with butcher's paper and going through that stretch loop thinking. We'll have a bit of an opportunity to report back to the room to really trigger some more creative thinking and moving straight back into scenario 2. So you'll be going through those stretch thinking loops for both scenarios, and at the end we will have a list of potential opportunities that have come out from the thinking at each of the tables. What we will attempt to be delivering by the end of the day is really having a look at those opportunities, having a sense in the room about some of the best opportunities that we've come up with, and also being able to vote on those opportunities as we move out of the room. So if you think about what we're actually trying to deliver to PESRAC is a really clear understanding about some potential opportunities that come out of these future scenarios. And that's where we'll be really focused. So that's how the session will go on the day. In terms of the rules for engagement and the guidelines, we have to be really disciplined. So all of us that are invited to these workshops, we're asking you to be very disciplined in how you interact on the day. So most importantly, just basic things like keeping your phones off, and not being distracted. But the most important part is really to be focused on what the task is that you've been able to do, to stick to the scenarios and the tool. So as Ace outlined, it's not an opportunity for you to make speeches or statements about other things that are going on. This is really a scenario-based workshop where we're asking you on your teams to work very clearly on the scenarios, the consequences, the constraints, and the opportunities. So ideally, you would want to make sure that you just get to your point, make the point, capture the point, and keep moving. Equally, it's really important that everybody has that opportunity. So once you've made one point, allow others to make sure on the table that everyone gets an opportunity to contribute. It's also really important, and I'll emphasise on the day, as Steve has, that no ideas are bad. We're here to stretch each other and think about the future of Tasmania and what's possible for all of us. So no ideas are bad. We want you to stretch your thinking, and you won't be quoted. So anything that's said in the room on the day, it will be Chatham House rules. So you're there, you've been invited to attend because of your personal capacity and capability. You've been selected to participate because we think you can. So we look forward to you being really disciplined on the day to stick to those guidelines and rules of engagement.
Okay, so we're almost done. So getting ready and preparing. We'll send you the detailed description of the scenarios. And I'm just re-emphasise the point that they're not predictions about what we think is the most likely way that COVID is going to play out. Nobody knows what the future of COVID is going to be. There are effectively an infinite number of scenarios that we could focus on. These are two that we've landed on to help us do this creative thinking exercise. So if you could read those and read them carefully and then consider them and really think about them. Think about them from your own personal experience, your own reflections on them, the way in which the organisations that you operate within might see the world in that context, and the community. Really try and envisage what Tasmania in 2023 could look like if scenario A were to play out and scenario B were to play out. Have a think about the potential consequences for your sector in particular, because that's the hat that we hope that you wear in these scenarios. So think about the consequences for the sector broadly. Think about the constraints that might exist if that 2-year story were to play out, and really start thinking about those opportunities and come with those things in mind. Some notes if that's helpful to you. As Alicia said, there'll be a little bit of time at the beginning of the workshop, at the begining of each of those scenarios, to do a little bit of personal reflection. Hopefully you can do that ahead of turning up. And the real gem of this, we hope, is not necessarily just the thoughts that you bring in. It's really the workshopping of the thoughts around the table and people responding and reflecting on what's being brought on the table. That's the gem of the creative process. We'll be capturing that on Butcher's paper. And lastly, just in terms of getting ready, there's some COVID-safe material for each of the venues that we're being at. Could you also read that, if that hasn't, I don't know if that's been distributed as yet. Yeah, I think it has. I'm being told it has. So particularly if you wake up on the day and you've got any cold or flu-like symptoms, we love you, but please don't turn up. That would be consistent with our COVID safety measures. So if you could read those COVID safety measures and honour those. So with that, that's the formal part of today covered. Just some key points to take away. These scenario sessions are really integral to the Council's thinking and the development of their recommendations. There's a bit of, Alicia was saying before we came online that she's picked up from some of her clients. There's a level of interest out there. The word is getting out that these workshops are on. And it's a sought after opportunity. We've only got 9 of them. and we can, because of the COVID arrangements, we can only have limited participation at them. So we're really pleased that you've made yourself available to participate in this. It's going to be a really important piece of work to feed up a set of whole estate recommendations that the council will make. When we're doing this, and what this is all about, is the development of those practical recovery ideas that will deliver outcomes into a 2 to 5 year time frame. We're not looking for quick wins, and we're not looking for long-term big picture strategies. We're trying to get Tasmania back to a good, strong social and economic foundation, and out of this process, this is key for us developing those recommendations. The scenarios themselves are a stretch thinking process to deliver new ideas. The scenarios are stories for that purpose, they're not predictions. You can imagine the front page of a newspaper where PESRAC predicts that scenario B that we've gone through. The council predicts no vaccine for 3 years. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're not saying that is what's going to happen. They are stories to assist our creative thinking. There are no bad ideas. We're here to stretch and get new ideas. There are no bad contributions on the day. I will stress, Chatham House, you won't be quoted. Any contribution made on the day by any individual won't be ascribed to themselves. It won't be ascribed to their organisation that they come from, or who even nominated or suggested that we approach you about the opportunity. We're going to aggregate this to create a themes-based response from the council. And lastly, please come prepared. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today. And thank you very much for agreeing to take part this week. As I said, there are 9 of these to be happening between this week and mid-October. So it's a fair bit of work for us to get through, and it's going to be very valuable. So I look forward to meeting you later in the week. And until then, be safe.